All right. I believe, am I recording? Yes, I am. Okay, very good. All right. I was lecturing last time. This was on Friday. And I was going through my Welcome to the Wonderful World of Philosophy lecture, and I had planned on doing it all in just one big long lecture. And then I was getting these repeated phone calls from relatives. I'm thinking, oh, is something up? Is somebody sick or whatnot? So I stopped. Now everything's fine. However, I'm now recording the second half of that introductory lecture. So I'm going to continue on, and I want to share my screen. Which one do I want to share? Here we are. Share. And this is where we left off last time, right? So where what I was doing here, slideshow. Come on now. From current slide. So this introductory lecture is, I'm looking at the methodology of philosophy and the content or subject area of philosophy, right? So what is it that philosophers do? And that's the methodology. And what do they do it with, right? What's the subject areas? What are it's a domain of inquiry that is defined by certain sets of questions, and that's what we'll be looking at. So last time I was talking about what philosophers do, right? And you know, I get this like at parties and things like that, where they go, "Oh, you're a philosopher." Well, yeah, I teach philosophy, okay. And well, so what do you do? Do you sit around and philosophize? Oh, yes, but what does that mean? Well, as I hope you saw from the earlier presentation, we argue, right? We read, we write, we argue. We propose theories, we try to justify theories, we critique justifications and evaluate justifications. Sometimes we have to modify. There's first process, that dialectical process that we talk about in the first half of this lecture, which is theory postulation, justification, critical review, and then of course when necessary, revision, right? So this is what philosophers do. But how does that distinguish philosophy from modern science? And as I mentioned the last time, there wasn't a clear distinction in the early days of philosophy. I would say up until the 1600s, philosophy was not thought of being uniquely separate from other forms of rational inquiry like science. But today it is. And today, science and philosophy occupy different domains of inquiry, and subjects which are proper to one are usually not proper to the other. This is my view. So, so here on this screen, I have posted what I take to be the domain of philosophy, right? Philosophy seeks to answer questions which are not empirical. So you cannot simply answer these or discharge these questions through empirical investigation. But they're not meaningless questions either. They're not nonsense questions. They're meaningful questions which can and do admit of answers, some of which are better or worse than others, more reasonable or less reasonable. So that in an essence, in a nutshell, is what I think is the domain of philosophy. And I think I gave you one such example in the last part of the first half of this lecture, which is there a God? Right? Well, this doesn't seem to be a meaningless question that no answer makes any sense, like what is the color of love or how high is up? No, the problem is quite the opposite. There are two answers that make sense, at least two, yes and no. And I, for one, would be very interested to know which of either one of those perfectly reasonable answers is true, or at least which can garner more rational support if either one. So that is an example, I think, of a philosophical question. I did this already, right? But it leads us into our first branch of philosophy. And this is actually the first branch of philosophy we'll be looking at in this class, which is natural theology. And natural theology is that branch of philosophy which seeks to answer questions about the nature and the existence of God, right? Now notice, natural theology, which is a branch of philosophy, needs to be distinguished from revealed theology. A revealed theology is also theology, study of God, theology, right? But it's the study of God through revelation. Revealed theology often believes that God has revealed himself in sort of supernatural ways through inspired texts or through mystical experiences, etc. And so it's a relying to try to answer questions about God through revelation, right? So it usually takes it as a matter of faith that God has supernaturally revealed himself to us, maybe through sacred scriptures or a holy institution or the history of a chosen people, etc. But since it is a faith-based method for trying to answer such questions, it is importantly different than natural theology. So natural theology attempts to answer questions about the existence of God, but it's not based on faith in or supernatural access to these things. It's really based on natural reason and what can be gained through ordinary experience of the world. Other philosophers have made different distinctions. I'm going to come up with 6 different branches of philosophy. Other philosophers have sometimes carved up the pie slightly differently into bigger or smaller slices, but I like this particular way of dividing up the branches of philosophy. So that's what we'll be working with in this course, the 6 branches of philosophy as I slice them up. Another branch of philosophy would be the branch of philosophy called metaphysics. And metaphysics is that branch of philosophy which seeks to answer questions about the types and structure of existence, right? So what would be an example of a metaphysical question? Well, it might be, is there an immaterial soul, right? Do human beings have immaterial souls? And what reasons, if any, do we think the answer to that question is yes? And what reasons, if any, do we have to think that the answer to that question is no? Now notice, like, is there a God? It's clear, or it seems clear to me, fairly clear, that this is not a scientific question. Because what is science going to do? They say, well, we looked for a soul and we didn't see one, right? Well, no, immaterial souls wouldn't be visible, right? They wouldn't be empirically accessible to us, at least not in any direct way. So the question of whether immaterial things at all exist seems to me to be a metaphysical question. And whatever reasons you think the answer to that question is yes, or whatever reason you might think the answer to that question is no, those reasons would be philosophical reasons, not scientific reasons, not empirical reasons, right? So here's an example of a metaphysical theory. There's one theory about that question: do immaterial things exist? Whether you want to talk about souls or God or anything like that. And the position of physicalism would say the answer to that question is no. There is no such thing as immaterial objects or forces. So this is the view that only physical things or material objects, material forces exist, and no non-material or not force or object exists. So this is a position known as physicalism. Now, at first, that might look like an unproblematic theory. And in fact, you might agree with that and think, oh, I like that. Maybe that's me. Maybe I'm a physicalist. But notice, if you start poking at it, it starts to fall apart pretty quickly, right? Because what about triangles? Triangles exist, don't they? I mean, didn't you have to learn a whole lot of things about triangles when you were taking geometry in class in high school? Or maybe you're taking something like that now, right? So they seem to be real things, but they're not material objects. Now, we have representations of triangles, right? Images drawn in books and that sort of stuff. But triangles, by their very nature, are 2-dimensional things. They're not 3-dimensional. And no matter how flat that triangle might be on the page of the book, it's actually a physical object that occupies 3 dimensions, not 2 dimensions. Notice then they don't seem to be physical. Or what about rainbows, right? Rainbows exist, don't they? I mean, what a sad world it would be if there were no such thing as rainbows, but they do exist. But you know, they don't exist in space, of course. You do know that, right? No matter how fast you drive, you're not going to be able to get to the rainbow because it does not exist in 3-dimensional space. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist at all. It just means that, like triangles, rainbows are not material objects that occupy 3 dimensions. Neither are shadows. Neither are corporations. Neither is Mozart's Jupiter Symphony. So here we have objects that seem to be real, that exist, that we have to account for somehow, but they don't seem to be physical objects. Now you might say, well, corporations exist, yeah, but they just are legal entities that are created by contracts and legal documents. Okay, fine, but the corporations and the legal documents are physical, right? The contracts are physical and exist in physical space. The court proceedings that bring about corporations are temporal objects in which things like lawyers and corporate executives exist, and they're physical objects. So you may be able to tell me a story about how physical things like contracts cause non-physical things like corporations, but now you're starting to build a metaphysical story, right? So there's more than one kind of thing, physical things. And maybe you can tell me a physical story about how things like water vapor and refracted light cause rainbows. And again, maybe tell me a story about how these physical objects and physical forces cause what is ultimately not a physical object or physical force, which is the rainbow. But that's how you're building your metaphysical system. So you might say, well, there's these illusory objects which are caused by physical objects, or there's these legal objects which are caused by physical objects. But notice, we're starting to get it to be a very complicated story about the kinds of things that exist and the relationship that they bear to one another. Now, what about Sherlock Holmes, right? Well, here you might want to draw the line and say, look, Sherlock Holmes does not exist, right? He never did exist, he never will exist, and there is no such thing as Sherlock Holmes. Okay. But he is English, right? Yes. And he's a detective, correct. And he has a friend named Watson, right. And he plays the piano. No, you might say. He plays the violin. Oh, I see. Well, how is it that this thing which doesn't exist, never did exist, never will exist, how is it that we can refer to it, we can know things about it, and we may even have false beliefs about it? Well, you might say, oh, okay, yeah, look, he has fictional existence. All right, wait, we start writing these down, right? Legal existence, fictional existence, illusory existence. And you might tell a story, again, about how physical objects called books and physical objects called authors that write the books create these fictional objects, which are themselves not physical. But again, you're going to start to tell a more complicated metaphysical story than you might get out of a strict physicalist account. But notice, physicalism itself is not a scientific theory, right? Scientists can neither prove that physicalism is true or prove that physicalism is false. So whatever reason you might have for thinking that physicalism is true or false, those are philosophical and more specifically metaphysical arguments and reasons, right? Now you might say something like this, well, look, we can explain everything we need to explain without appealing to physical object, we can explain everything we need to explain without appealing to non-physical objects. Therefore, the default position should be physicalism, since there doesn't seem to be any reason to doubt it. Right? All right, I have a little bit of a problem with that argument. First, because I think the initial premise is false, but whatever you think of that argument, it's not a scientific argument. It's a philosophical argument, right? The idea of one ought not to multiply entities beyond necessity, sometimes referred to as Occam's razor, is a metaphysical position, or a philosophical position, maybe an epistemological position, but not a scientific position, right? Okay. Again, what can science do to determine whether there's immaterial objects or not? Look, listen, taste, touch, feel, or use instruments to supplement that, but that's not going to detect or prove the non-existence of physical objects, immaterial objects. So again, any reasons one might offer for adopting or rejecting this metaphysical view would have to be philosophical reasons. A third branch of philosophy, epistemology, seeks to answer questions about the nature of knowledge, truth, and justification. So it's a theory of knowledge. An example of epistemological question might be this: is observation and experiment a reliable way of coming to know the world? Or is science a good way of coming to know objective truth? Or even more broadly, is it a good way of coming to know all? Is it an exhaustive way of coming to know objective truth? So these themselves are epistemological questions. Now, they might look scientific initially, but notice these too are not scientific questions. Because again, how could science answer the question whether observation is a reliable way of coming to know reality or not, when science relies on observation? So it's going to start by doing observation. So notice if you said, oh, I'm wondering whether I can count on science. And I said to you, don't worry about it. I did a whole lot of science, and the science I did said that science is good. Science is reliable. Yeah, but scroll up, right? If the problem is we're questioning the reliability of science, then doing science to verify science is what's called begging the question, right? It's assuming what we're attempting to prove. So there doesn't seem to be any question begging way for science to ratify itself. So again, the above was not a scientific question. Could we use science? That is, could we run an experiment or make an observation or take a poll to prove that science is reliable? No. Science assumes that observation and experiment are good ways of coming to know reality. Therefore, there's a circularity problem. One is beginning by assuming what one is trying to prove. That's called begging the question. Because science must use experiment to prove the value of experiments if it were to try to do so. Science assumes that observation and experiment are good ways of coming to know reality. Again, this is what's called begging the question. It's like writing your own letter of recommendation and assuring your prospective employer that she can believe every word of it because you're an honest person and a good judge of character, as you say in your letter. Right? So imagine that the prospective employer is looking over this letter, and it says that, oh, it says here that you're very punctual, you're reliable, you're a self-starter. I like that. You think outside the box. You're a team player, using certain catchphrases. And also, but who wrote this? And you say, oh, I wrote it myself. You go, well, how do I know I can believe any of that? So, oh, because I'm a good judge of character. See, I said that in the letter. Yes, I know, but how do I know I can trust you here? Oh, I'm very trustworthy. I put that in there too. Well, of course, you can't write your own letter of recommendation. Neither can science, right? So if the New York Times publishes that it's the best newspaper in the world, and then you say, well, how do you know it's the best newspaper in the world? And you say, well, because the New York Times says it is. But how I know I can believe the Times? Well, because it's the best newspaper in the world. Again, there's a circularity problem, right? So you have to have a philosophical discussion to assess what is the best way of coming to know objective reality. Now, here might be an example of such an argument. You might say, science provides us with the most useful theories. Useful theories are true theories. Therefore, science is providing us with true theories. Right? And this is a very scaled down version of a position referred to as pragmatism, which we may talk about later on in this course. Now, whatever you think of this argument, and frankly, I have a little bit of a problem with premise too, it's not a scientific argument. It's a philosophical argument. More specifically, it's an argument from epistemology. Right? Ethics is a fourth branch of philosophy, which seeks to answer questions about human conduct. Right? Example of an ethical question would be, what should I do? Now notice, because I'm asking what should I do, I'm asking a question which is prescriptive in nature. I'm asking for someone to prescribe to me what I ought to do. It's not a descriptive question. And again, this is why ethics does not belong to the empirical sciences. Ethical questions are not empirical and cannot be settled by science alone. Notice, science can tell us about just about everything we could possibly want to know about human cloning, except whether we ought to do it or not. Right? Because science can tell us, notice science is a descriptive project. It's trying to describe how the world is. It may even be trying to predict how the world will be or is likely going to turn out. But these are descriptive tasks. and maybe predictive tasks, but they're not prescriptive. So what ethics is trying to tell us is how the world ought to be, how I ought to behave. I mean, how do human beings behave? Well, they give money to charity and they cheat on their taxes. And they are gratuitously insulting and they help old women across the street. Well, some of these are ways we ought to behave, and some of these are ways in which human beings ought not to behave. And it's going to take some sort of ethical argument or investigation to sort that out. How should we behave and how should we not behave? Notice, no amount of observation of the world can tell us how the world ought to be. It only tells us how the world is. There are sciences of human conduct, psychology, sociology, history, marketing, but these are descriptive, not prescriptive. Therefore, ethical questions, while meaningful and admitting of better or worse answers, are not themselves scientific questions. And did I skip over the definition? I don't want to go back, but it's in the notes, and I may, but I just don't remember reading it, which is ethics is that branch of philosophy which seeks to answer questions about right human conduct. So it's necessarily concerned with human conduct. It's necessarily concerned with distinguishing right human conduct from wrong human conduct. Number 5, aesthetics is a branch of philosophy which seeks to answer questions about art and beauty. Now, nowadays, we might think about questions of beauty as being separable from questions of art, and questions of art being separable from questions of beauty. And indeed, there are many questions today about art that don't involve questions of beauty and vice versa. But historically, it would be very difficult to talk about art without also talking about beauty, and it would also be very difficult to talk about beauty without also talking about art. And so historically, there was a single branch of philosophy that dealt with both. Nowadays, contemporarily, these two have become disentangled, and so they do sort of form separate question sets. But they're both dealt with in the branch of philosophy called aesthetics, where you take a course in aesthetics. You might deal with beauty or art, or likely you would deal with both, right? So one question might be, can a load of bricks dumped in the corner of an art gallery be a work of art? Well, it kind of depends on what the nature of art is, or what the nature of art can be. And that requires a philosophical discussion about the nature of art. Likewise, is beauty merely in the eye of the beholder, so that what's beautiful to me may not be beautiful to you, and that my judgments of beauty are subjective to me, and your judgments of beauty are subjective to you? Or can one be wrong in one's judgments of beauty? Is there an objectivity to beauty? Well, again, that's not an empirical question. I think it can be informed by an empirical investigation. So I think cognitive science might have interesting things to help inform a discussion about the nature of beauty, and for that matter, even the nature of art. But it doesn't exhaust those questions. Even once the cognitive scientists have done everything they can about the cognition of art and beauty, there would still be aesthetic questions left over. So whatever your answer to these two questions on the slide might be, they are philosophical or aesthetic in nature. And one can only defend your answer by engaging in a philosophical discussion or an aesthetic argument. Here's an example of an aesthetic theory. To be a work of art is to enjoy a certain social standing, not to have any specific objective qualities. So one theory, contemporary theory about art, is to say when something becomes a work of art, it's not because it has certain objective features, it's because it's been inducted into the art world. So if there's some piece of driftwood lying off on Miami Beach, well, it's not art. However, if I bring it into a gallery and I set it in a pedestal and I have an art opening and I unveil it and I say, this is my new work of art, I call it Driftwood I Found on Miami Beach on Monday. Well, now we have to ask the question, is that art, right? Has it been brought into the art world, and does it now enjoy a different social standing? Not because it's acquired new properties, but it's acquired a new social identity. In the same way that when I get married, I don't physiologically change, And you can't detect married people from unmarried people by doing some empirical investigation, because it's not some sort of biological fact about the individual, it's some social fact. So when I get married, I have new expectations that are brought to me. I am regarded differently by my fellows in society. Maybe I'm accorded different privileges. And in the same way that when something is brought in to be a work of art, we bring different expectations to it, we engage with it differently, we maybe accord to it different privileges, etc. So this is a theory of art, right? I like it sometimes. I think Monday, Wednesday, Fridays, I think it might be correct. Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, I don't like it so much, but it's one theory, right? So I say, for instance, when I marry, I undergo no physical change, but my relation to the community changes. I have different social identity. I'm given a new role, privileges, and expectations. This view can explain why, under the right circumstances, a load of bricks dumped in the corner of a gallery could become a work of art if it undergoes a certain induction procedure. Logic, we'll be saying more about logic later. In fact, the next lecture is going to be on logic extensively, but now we'll just say it's a branch of philosophy which analyzes and evaluates arguments. Notice, before we move on to logic, notice because philosophy depends on the dialectical process and argument analysis so heavily, it's not surprising that it developed its own branch of itself to be critical, right? So this is the branch of logic. As I said, we'll be speaking more about that later. So now, what is the relationship between philosophy and science? Well, hopefully I've been sketching that out for you. I think that science and philosophy share their methodology, again, in broad outline, right? Theory, postulation, justification, critical review, revision, that dialectical process, right? But notice they don't share the questions. The questions that belong to science do not belong to philosophy. Philosophers shouldn't be trying to answer empirical questions. There's no point in two philosophers arguing about how much beer was consumed in Milwaukee in 2016. Why? It's an empirical question. And so it would require an empirical investigation, and philosophy has no insights into these matters. This is true for any of the sciences, the social sciences, history, etc. However, and again, so if the question could be answered by experiment or observation, then it belongs to science. If it doesn't belong to the sciences, and if it's not a nonsense question, then I claim it belongs to philosophy. Right? However, the interesting thing is that I think philosophy and world religions often have exactly the opposite relationship. And I'm thinking principally about Western monotheistic religions, but I think this can be true of certain other world religions, right? Because philosophy and religion share many of the same questions, right? Philosophy wants to talk about God. Oh, religion wants to talk about God. Philosophy wants to talk about what is real, what exists, souls. Well, religion wants to talk about what's real and what exists. Philosophy wants to talk about what we should know or can know, or what we should believe. So does religion. Philosophy wants to talk about how we should behave, how we should conduct our lives. So does religion. And philosophy wants to even talk about art and beauty. Well, religion often has a lot to say about the nature of art and beauty. So I think theological questions, metaphysical questions, epistemological questions, ethical questions, aesthetic questions, I think they belong both to world religions and to Western philosophy. However, they don't take the same way of answering them. So while they share the questions, they don't share the methodology. As I mentioned, religion tries to answer these questions very often based on faith. But in philosophy, nothing is based on faith. Nothing is based on accepting without a critical examination or without critical support, any body of beliefs. So religion, and again, I have in mind the Western religions, begins from a certain foundation, accepting a certain body of beliefs as truth that has been divinely revealed and that is not to be questioned. Rather, it is to be accepted without evidence or without justification. It's regarded as a matter of faith. Now faith, quoting Hebrews here, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So when somebody says, oh, this is a matter of faith for me, This is a nice way of them telling you, I'm not going to argue about this. This is not a provisional hypothesis that I'm holding on to for the moment unless something better comes along. No, it means that they're invested in this, and that this is not something that they are willing to question or give up. It's something that they're committed to, and they're not going to be arguing about it. But philosophy does not maintain any body of beliefs which are sacred or to be accepted without question. Notice, as mentioned in the first lecture, there were some philosophers who really wonder whether there's any value to philosophy itself. So the very value of philosophy is up for debate within philosophy. Now, this is made for and continues to make for some tension between philosophy and religion. They're working the same side of the street, so to speak, because they're both engaged in conversations about many of the same matters. Some philosophers have criticized religion as irrational superstition and uncritical intellectual enslavement. I'm thinking of popular intellectuals these days, sometimes referred to jointly as the new atheist, right? Formerly the late Christopher Hitchens, but Daniel Dennett and Stephen Dawkins and Sam Harris, who really do believe that religion is a kind of intellectual enslavement and irrational. Albert Camus had said that religious faith is intellectual suicide, I think he said. Right? On the other hand, there are religious individuals that have criticized philosophy as merely blasphemous human arrogance, ignoring or even denying the author of truth. And so there are criticisms of philosophy from various religious quarters saying, it's that sin of pride all over again. You think you're going to come up with all the answers, come up with all the truths, when you're ignoring the source of truth and when you're ignoring God's revelation that he's made so plain to us. Right? However, there have been some who believe that there need be no tension at all. And in fact, some have argued that faith and reason are not merely compatible, but they're actually mutually complementary. So Thomas Aquinas, Saint Thomas Aquinas, the angelic doctor, Saint Thomas Aquinas would be one example of such an individual who thinks that there really isn't any tension between philosophy and faith, and that when one does philosophy appropriately and correctly and carefully, one arrives at many of the same conclusions that has been the deliverances of faith. He might be overly optimistic, but we'll look at that in some detail when we move on to natural theology later on in this course. Now, if philosophy did have any operating assumptions, they might be these. So I will admit that probably philosophy does have some operating assumptions. The first operating assumption is this, that the universe can be understood, at least to some extent, right? Or reality is understandable to human beings. Again, it's a rather modest claim. Or it is possible for humans to make some sense of the world. So you kind of have to start there. If you don't start there, well, then there really isn't very much use to going on it for inquiry, right? If you don't begin by assuming that we can make out some claims about the world. But beyond that, denying premise one is self-refuting, right? If I said, no, there's nothing understandable in the universe, well, of course, you see, I've just sawed off the branch I was standing on because I'm claiming that I know something, and I know something to be true. And what I know to be true is that there are no objective truths. Okay, that's self-contradictory. So, but I will say that one is kind of an operating assumption. But I think for philosophy, the philosophy project to get going, you also have to take operating assumption 2. And operating assumption 2 is this, that unaided human reason is capable of understanding this reality to some extent. Right? And what do I mean by unaided human reason? Well, I mean unalloyed with faith or with revelation. Right? So notice there are certain religions that accept number 1, and they do think that human beings can make some sense of the world, but they deny number 2. They deny that unaided human reason is really going to be able to come up with that kind of understanding, and that understanding is the product of other processes, supernatural processes, revelation, perhaps mystical experiences, etc. And so these religions are mystical religions then, because I think genuine truth can be had, but it can't be had through ordinary human experience and ordinary human reason. It's only had through supernatural, extraordinary experiences, mystical experiences or whatnot. Now, because Thomas Aquinas and other Catholic theologians thought that reason was an independent means to God's truth, so they did believe in God and they did believe in God's truth, but they thought that reason provided an alternative means to that truth. In other words, they accepted number two. The Catholic religious traditions have are a little bit more open to the idea of the usefulness of philosophy than, say, certain evangelical Protestant traditions, such as the Calvinists. Many evangelical Protestant traditions follow what they see to be St. Augustine's position, and they deny number two. They claim that since the intellect, as well as the will, is in a fallen and corrupted state, it is too corrupt and prone to sin and error, and therefore faith and the grace of God are necessary for any adequate understanding of reality. So they said without faith and without the perfecting grace of God, human reason is never going to come up with the right answers. Why? Because just like the will, it is in a fallen state and prone to sin and error, arrogance and whatnot. Right? And when I say they're following St. Augustine, they follow, maybe I say this in the next slide. Yes, I do. Okay. So this is from, I think his, I forget what the work is. Advice to Christians or something like that. I forget. He wrote lots. Augustine wrote lots. So I won't read the slide because that drives students nuts, but I will go to the second to last sentence. For understanding is the reward of faith. Sometimes that's rendered as understanding is the fruit of faith. Right? Therefore, do not seek to understand in order to believe, but believe that you may understand. Since except ye believe, you shall not understand. Well, if we take him quite literally there, that does seem to suggest that you could do all the philosophizing in the world. If you don't start with belief, your philosophizing is never going to come up with the correct answers. So he does seem to be denying operating assumption number two there. And as I said, there are evangelical Christians and Calvinists and others who that is precisely how they interpret him. Aquinas, centuries later, and others have interpreted Augustine not quite so literally there. We don't need to deal with that right now. It's a point of theology and history of religions, and that's not really my field anyway. But I just go on to point out that I do think philosophy has these two operating assumptions, and we'll be utilizing both as we continue on. Okay, so that brings me to the end of the first set of lecture notes. And I'll probably be adding these kinds of Zoom lectures. So any Zoom lectures you see are going to be relatively recent, but I'll probably still rely on certain older canned lectures. And so again, you may see vacillating where I seem much more youthful in one set of lectures than another, and it's just because they're old. So, all right, that concludes my remarks for today, and I hope you found this helpful.